I'm going to give it just another minute, but I know that we have more than Warren on the webinar. If others want to introduce themselves, no pressure, but would love to know who's here in the virtual room. Helps our speakers kind of tailor their remarks a little bit. So glad you're all here with us today. Happy Friday, everyone. Hi, Ron. Hello, Malavika. Thank you for being here. Ron to learn and connect. Malavika to learn more about outcomes relevant to California propositions from the recent election, understand what opportunities exist for funders in our network. That is a great goals both. Hi, Lynn, welcome. Hi, Tim. Thank you for joining us today. I think I'll go ahead and get started with housekeeping as folks continue to join. Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Pellisier. I manage programs and conferences at Southern California Grantmakers, and I'm so thrilled to be hosting this conversation today. If you're just joining us, please add your name, organization, where you're joining us from, and one reason you're here today in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. A little bit about this webinar. So as some of you know, Southern California Grantmakers hosts quarterly environmental funders groups webinars on a wide variety of topics. So this is our last quarterly webinar of the year. The content of these sessions are shaped by a steering committee of SCG members. Anyone is welcome to join if you're interested. It's a pretty minimal time commitment, but it just helps us frame the topics that we cover each quarter of the year. So please reach out to me if you are interested in joining. The steering committee and these webinars are led by Ron Milam, who is SCG's environmental consultant and on with us today. So you can reach out to him as well. And today we're really thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar with Smart Growth California and the Environmental Grantmakers Association. So welcome to members of those two organizations as well. We have loved being able to partner more now that we're doing these as webinars instead of in person. Makes it easier for folks to join from all over. So that's been really great. A few tech tips. Small children and pets are welcome. We know the environment in which we are all joining today, so no problem at all. Folks are entering the webinar automatically muted and with your camera off. And that is just for the first part of the conversation with the panel so that you can just see, we'll take these slides off in just a moment, but you'll just be able then to see the speakers. And then during the Q&A portion, we invite you, if you're able, to turn your camera on and engage in more direct questions and dialogue with our speakers. We suggest hiding non-video participants. If you don't know how to do that, you hover. It basically makes it so that you only see folks with their cameras on. You'll only see the cameras of the speakers. So if you are seeing black boxes with names on them, hover in the top right and hit the 3 dots and click hide non-video participants, and then you will only see folks with their cameras on. So you can do either gallery view and see everyone at once, or you can do speaker view and just see the person who is talking. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to direct chat me, and I'm happy to share more information. My colleague Jacqueline Carrillo is also on, providing critical backend support. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. So if folks have any tech issues or questions, feel free to direct chat Jacqueline as well. As the conversation goes along, please feel free to use the chat box to share resources, questions, etc. We'll compile all the resources that get shared during the conversation and send them out in a follow-up email. So feel free to populate that as we go. What else do I want to share? Our structure for today. So we are going to be spending the first hour in conversation on the topic at hand, and then we're going to switch for the last 30 minutes into some small group breakouts and networking. We know that we're all really missing the one-on-one and small group conversations that we used to be able to have when these were in person. So we're going to try a new structure today and replicate that a little bit. So we'll have our panel conversation and Q&A for the first hour, and then we'll be able to do a deeper dive. The speakers will be able to stay on in small groups, and you can do a deeper dive, asking follow-up questions or sharing what you're doing in funding related to the conversation in those small groups. So we hope you'll stay for that. And we also hope you'll give us feedback afterwards on how that was for you and how we can continue to not only provide educational content, but also provide more networking and connections in these sessions as well. So it's all learning and work in progress, and really welcome your feedback. I think that's all I have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, a member of SCG's Environmental Funders Group Steering Committee and Program Officer at the Roy and Patricia Disney Family Foundation, Roger Perez. Thank you, Roger, so much.
Thanks, Katie. And really excited to be here today. Happy Friday, everybody. I can't believe it's Friday. I can't believe it's November 20th, and that you mentioned that we're the last meeting of the year, which is 2020 has been a strange one, and it's gone really fast and really slow. So thank you all for coming today, and I'm really excited for today. My name is Roger Perez. I'm a program officer at the Roy and Patricia Disney Family Foundation here in Los Angeles. And at our PDFF, we focus on affordable housing preservation, criminal justice reform, and environmental justice here in South and East Los Angeles, as well as in New Orleans and Tacoma, Washington. And for all of our program areas, we focus on supporting predominantly BIPOC-led organizations who are ensuring that community voice is at the center of community development. And so this will look a lot like supporting organizations involved in base building, power building, and connecting local efforts and local organizing to policy advocacy and systems change. And this makes me really excited for today. We have the pleasure of speaking with three really amazing folks at the forefront of environmental policy on local, state, and national scales. And it'll give us the opportunity to learn, and how we on this call can think about how we can affect systems here in our communities in Los Angeles and on a more broader scale. And this is at a very important time as we're coming off the heels of a national election that's been called by a lot. It's still contested, unfortunately. And as we're transitioning from an administration that's rolled back more than 100 environmental rules, which have been catastrophic. This has opened up new oil and gas. These rollbacks have introduced new oil and gas leasing on public lands, weakened power plant restrictions, and limited California's ability to set some stricter tailpipe emissions for vehicles, and amended rules that's making it easier for polluting industries to really just continue to pollute. These actions have not only negatively impacted clean water, air, and soil, but have also contributed to climate change and have been disastrous for communities living close proximity to polluters. And this is something that I think we all know that happens in Los Angeles. According to New York Times, and thanks to local partners like Stand LA, in LA County, half a million people live within a half a mile of an active oil well. And of the 1.8 million people most impacted by environmental pollution, 92% of them are people of color. The chemicals associated with oil drilling are well known to cause asthma, nosebleeds, high-risk pregnancies, cancer, among many, many others. And oil drilling is just one issue among many other environmental injustices and environmental issues happening here in Southern California. And I think it was really tough for all of us, the folks on the call, and just broadly to operate under these realities the past 4 years of this administration. And for many to come to terms with how historical racist planning policies have really ingrained environmental injustices. What keeps me going, however, are the folks that keep pushing back, keep creating the systems that we want to see. And recently, fortunately, we've seen this on a local scale, thinking about, Long Beach and increasing the cost of oil extraction to hopefully, increasing the cost of oil extraction. Also advancing AB 617 in Southern California to hopefully remedy some of the notorious poor air quality. And of course, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, with this new federal administration, it'll continue to push us closer to a more livable future. So with that, I'll stop talking. I'll turn to the experts, to the great people on the panel that we have today to hear about their perspective on what's to come. After we get a few short introductions from them, we're going to pass on to a couple of moderated questions for each one of the speakers. And then we're going to open up to the room. We'd really like to hear what you all have to say, what you're thinking about, what's top of mind. As these things begin to pop up, feel free to pop them into the chat and we can loop back into the discussion, or the speakers will have a chance to answer them as we go along. So Sam, could you kick it off for us? Just an intro of who you are, what you're up to, and what your expertise is.
Indeed. Hello, everyone. So, my name is Sam Ricketts. I'm a co-founder of the group Evergreen Action, a climate advocacy organization fighting for national mobilization to confront the climate crisis and to build a just and thriving clean energy economy. That organization was born out of the ashes of the Jay Inslee for President campaign, for which I served as climate policy director. Prior to that, I spent over a decade working for Governor Inslee and Congressman Inslee in a variety of capacities just up the coast there to in your neighboring Washington state. I'm simultaneously also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where I spend time also working in this space, and in particular working to build bridges across the climate movement, particularly with EJ and labor partners, and in taking the lessons and the coalitions from state and local progress and trying to bring them to bear in Washington, D.C. A real pleasure to be joining you all.
And Kara, we'll pass it to you.
Sure. Hi, folks. Thanks so much for hosting me today. It's great to be here. Thank you, Roger and Katie and SoCal grant makers. I'm Kara Horowitz. I co-direct the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA Law School. It's UCLA Law's environmental law program. We've been in existence now for a little over 10 years. We were the first law school center focused on climate change law and policy. And I've been at UCLA that whole time examining local, state, national, and international climate policy. I teach classes in climate law and policy, and I'm thrilled to be here today. Oh, sorry. In the interest of full disclosure, I should also say I'm a board member of Climate Resolve, which is, as many of you may know, is a local organization working on climate policy in Los Angeles.
And last but not least, Katie.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. My name is Katie Valenzuela. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an environmental justice consultant based in Sacramento, getting ready to take a city council seat, so I've scaled back my advocacy to be part-time. My clients include Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment and the Green Lining Institute, as well as positions for social responsibility in Los Angeles. But prior to this role, I was the policy and political director for the California Environmental Justice Alliance. I was the first consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies here in California. And even prior to that was co-chair of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee during the last scoping plan update. My story starts in Kern County, where I was born and raised in Oildale, surrounded by the largest oil fields in the state of California. And so this work is very personal to me, and I'm happy to be here to talk about that.
Thank you, all three of you. I mean, I think it's pretty amazing to have all perspectives on the call today, and I think it's going to lead to I think a really robust, really rich conversation. And again, as things come up, as thoughts come up for you all in the room, feel free to put them into the chat. We can either answer them there or follow up in the following discussion. And Sam, I guess I'll turn to you with the first question. As someone in DC who's worked with multiple campaigns, and at the moment close to federal policy, could you tell us about your perspective of the new administration plan? Joe and Kamala have pretty bold promises that have us on a path to carbon neutrality by 2050 by investing in transit, infrastructure, housing, energy sectors, among a lot of others. So why is this important, and what does this mean for the nation? And if there are, tell us about some of the gaps that may exist.
Yeah, no, thank you, Roger, and it's a pleasure to get a chance to join you all for this dialogue. Yeah, we sit at this incredible moment. I mean, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate what has transpired in the course of 2020 in this presidential contest and what it's meant for climate action, for the national dialogue on environmental racism, for building a more just and equitable economy, for the pursuit of good jobs and a better, more equitable economy, and how different that is. I think an enormous credit to a movement, or really a suite of different movements that have congealed into a nationwide movement that has brought itself to bear upon a presidential campaign, and now a victorious presidential campaign and a transition operation. You're right in pointing to the Biden and Harris campaign plan that they ran on and won on, and I think it's worth taking stock of what that has really meant. The Build Back Better agenda put forward by the campaign in July is singularly the most ambitious and comprehensive presidential campaign climate plan we've ever seen. And now it's not only been put forward, but it's won the White House. I'm just going to go ahead and say that, call it, the election's over. But furthermore, not only was it just a policy agenda, the Biden-Harris campaign ran on this. They used this as one of their primary emphasis points. They used it as a closing message. They ran climate-focused advertisements in at least 2 swing states that they won, in Arizona and Michigan. We have seen further that it is already firmly a part of the transition agenda. President-elect Biden has spoken eloquently about the 4 crises facing the country, which of course is climate, but is also the crisis of racial injustice, the crisis of the current coronavirus pandemic, and the associated economic crisis that relates to each of these things and more. And you've already seen some of the commitments that they've made, the transition website, some of the diverse group that they put together to help think through transition and how they build climate into their administration. Even yesterday, there was some great reporting by Bloomberg about the plans to basically build the Council on Environmental Quality within the White House as a real force for a whole of government environmental justice agenda. Now that said, there's a challenge. There's going to be challenges, and there's always going to be challenges in turning campaign promises into action. As they say, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. This challenge is compounded by the fact that the United States Senate, until and unless the Georgia election is resolved favorably for climate action, is going to be remaining in the hands of someone of leadership that cares not for action on climate or good jobs or justice, and quite the opposite. And so what does that leave us? What does that mean? Where do we start to go from here on November 20th as we move into January 2021 and beyond? What do we do? What do we all do together? What does our movement do? I would point to 4 different things. Number 1, continue to press upon and work with and help formulate what it really means to have a full whole of government national mobilization against the crisis. Every agency is a cabinet agency now. Thankfully, that's not just us saying it. That's the Biden-Harris transition team saying it. And so making sure every agency is going to use all of its powers for climate action, for environmental justice, for creation of good jobs. And every agency does have a role to play, some more than others. 2, unlocking investments. And really, this is an agenda about building a better economy, a more equitable economy for American people, as much as it's about stopping greenhouse gas pollution, and using existing federal resources and authorities and financings, procurement to drive into these goals, but getting more from Congress. And that's going to require prioritizing that in negotiations with Congress, specifically in negotiations with the Senate. So bringing pressure to bear against the Biden-Harris administration, against congressional Democrats in the House, against every federal lawmaker, to ensure that these types of investments are prioritized so that we can build back better in a way that sustains itself for economic recovery in a truly sustainable way. And then 3rd, crucially, this is going to require, and thankfully we have an opportunity now for a more robust partnership with state and local governments and local communities around the country. The one thing that Biden and Harris have now is a whole lot more to build off of when it comes to state and local leadership and community-based leadership. They've got many more commitments that have been made. They've got many more policies that have been passed that they can either learn from or help to continue to support at the state and local level around the country. No state's done it all. No offense, California, not even you, but there's a lot to build upon, and there's a lot more pushing to do. And that leads me to my final point, which is all of this attention on federal action is key. It's crucial. It's the first time in, I'd say, a decade we actually have a meaningful chance to advance the ball forward on federal policy. I was around the last time we tried, and mostly failed in Washington, D.C. to do so. But this is also a chance now to double down and continue to make progress at the state and local level. We've got to. We've always known this is not going to be just a federal thing, or we've always known, especially in the last 5 years, as states have really stepped up on 100% clean energy. We've always known we're going to need action in states, in cities, in communities, in businesses, in academia, full bore ahead. Everyone's got to be doing everything that they've been doing, and then much more if we're really going to try to achieve 1.5C and get to decarbonization by mid-century. And so the continued investment in building out centers of power and in making the ball roll forward on state and local policy is also critical. And obviously, nowhere has that been more critical or possibly more fruitful than in California, both at the state level and the local level. So I would say lots to do, but I'm optimistic and I'm excited about the path forward. in particular, the new administration we have coming into town in DC. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I'm really glad you mentioned that. The factor, some of the key points of it's not a net zero sum game. You can work on an economy and environment at the same time, and you need to keep pushing. On the federal level, yes, we have some more progressive folks, but continue to push down into the local and even into the community aspect. Katie, I'd like to ask you the next question, and it's a two-part question, so sorry about that. I'll post in the chat too, so as not to get too confusing. But as someone who's in Sacramento, close to California policy, and has a wealth in the environmental justice space, could you tell us how this national framework fits in with California policy and environmental justice work? And also, I'm really interested on your perspective of how to hold elected officials accountable. In that same video that I quoted earlier, talking about oil wells and how they're close to individuals' homes, it also talks about how Bob Hertzberg, Ana Caballero, and Ben Hueso, who are 3 Democrats, rejected a bill that would provide a 2,500-foot setback from oil wells in people's homes. This is also known as AB 345, and coincidentally or not, all 3 of those individuals have had a history of receiving money from the oil and gas industry. So in light of this, and knowing that this probably isn't the only case or the most recent case, how do we continue to hold our elected officials accountable to ensure that the environment is a priority?
Those are great questions, Roger. Thank you. And if you go back to that hearing when that bill was voted down, the name that was being spat out of Senator Hertzberg's mouth was my name and the name of somebody in the Central Valley that we had brought to the hearing with us to testify about the need for AB 345. And that video was created in large part by many of the members of our coalition that are continuing that fight, in which I'm honored to help staff. But I'll circle back to that because I do want to start with what the lessons are from California for federal policy. A lot of other states, a lot of national level folks are looking to California and the lessons that we've learned here. And I think I want to start by grounding us in this pandemic, and in what it's taught us. It's taught us something that the environmental justice community has spoken about for a really long time, which is the intersection of economic justice and racial justice with climate justice. When that Harvard study came out showing that particulate matter was a vehicle for COVID, that it was actually facilitating the spread of COVID in our communities. And we knew that the communities impacted, overwhelmingly communities of color, were being impacted because they were essential workers, because they didn't have savings, because they weren't eligible for benefits programs, because they were living in crowded housing or substandard housing. All of these factors really created a crisis that was predictable and is going to happen again if we don't learn from what we're doing wrong in California and what we're doing right in California to really try to build federal policy that makes sense for where we need to go. So to help make the point, I am a visual person, so I'm going to share with you, California just released our most recent emissions inventory a few weeks ago. It goes up to 2018 now. And this chart is probably the chart you hear about the most. Look at California. We've exceeded our 2020 target early. We're so great, right? But when you really dig into from a perspective, sorry, I'm going to see if I can get this to go. There it is. When you look at sectors, though, you start to see something a little bit more troubling, right? Which is like clearly renewable energy and clean energy, thankfully, have been a huge driver of emissions reductions in California, as was the 2008 recession. But largely, you're seeing a lot of lines that are pretty flat. That are not really changing. And if you really hone in on this yellow line here, the industrial line, the line that affects frontline communities directly, what you see is something even more startling, which is the persistent impact specifically of fuel and fossil fuel extraction, production, and use that is continuing to grow in California despite the recessions, despite our climate policies. And our lack of action is directly impacting frontline communities, just like what Roger described in the introduction. We know what this is doing. So I will just wanted to start by prefacing that, because I think the story of California is that our lack of direct direct action. This reliance on market mechanisms to get the job done has meant that communities of color and low-income communities, BIPOC communities in California have continued to pay the price and have not seen the benefit of climate policy in California or the resulting investments or the health benefits or all the things that we keep saying, you'll get it someday. Well, it's been 14 years in California and we're still waiting. So in Southern California, for example, what this looks like is exactly what the New York Times video shows. It's communities living next to oil wells outside of their bedroom windows, outside of their playgrounds. When we know what that does, it's expanding. There's new permits every day that are being fought by those frontline groups and their lawyers. It looks like building decarbonization efforts, which sounds super great, but the reality is that technology is not affordable for low-income communities. And if we keep moving forward on building decar without addressing that issue, we will not only not benefit the people who need that the most, we're actually going to harm them in that process because we're not stopping to listen to communities. And so my overall takeaway here is that what I hope the Biden administration does, what I hope the California administration does, which we're still working on here, is really listen to what those communities are saying, because they have been flagging these issues for a decade. We have known for a decade that there's been a problem. On the EJ Advisory Committee, on every space I've been in, we've been banging this drum. You're missing something important. And how do we use that community expertise to inform real policy, real metrics, real data? The story behind something like CalEnviroScreen, which many of you know, what you may not know is that that was developed with communities. That was not a state project. There was an advisory council form of groups across the states that built that, and that's what makes it so effective. It's one of our few shining stars. But I just hope also that we recognize in this time when we need to move more quickly than ever, in this time when we know things are getting out of control on a variety of fronts, that it's even more important for us to strategically aim for interventions that are not just going to do climate, but are also going to help our economic and racial injustices. That Venn diagram has a nice big middle of strategies that we know will work if we focus and are thoughtful about who we bring into that process. And so to Roger's last point about accountability and what does accountability look like, and some of the pleasure of things like that New York Times video, things like Sunrise Los Angeles waking up Senator Hertzberg, I think several times after that vote happened to try to get him to change his mind, is that we are building political power. And the reality of like top-down approaches is that you miss the opportunity not to build the movement from the ground. And what the ground can do and what it's doing in California is almost every oil-backed candidate this cycle lost, almost every single one. If it was an open seat and it was an oil candidate versus an enviro-backed candidate, those oil candidates are losing. And they're losing because we have done the work in the communities of organizing and mobilizing. And we've also done the education work. We're making this a part of the conversation, not just at the Capitol, but in the communities, so folks understand, hey, wait a minute, if this is a challenge for me, if I've been impacted by this, which a lot of folks have, I need to not vote for that person because we're just going to get more of the same. So I know this isn't a political space, but I'm a huge believer in C4 impact funding. And I know a lot of funders are trying to explore that right now. A lot of these nonprofit C3 environmental justice groups are working on that for this exact reason. We are never going to get this through if we just keep trying to make the argument that we're right. We have to be able to play in the space that the industry is playing in, and that means we have to get much more political in the coming years as more people term out of the California legislature in 2022 and 2024. So that's my long answer, Roger, to your long question. Thank you again.
No, I really appreciate it because it's needed, you know, to be able to disaggregate that data, take a good look at what those trends are telling us, and to understand that, you know, folks that are in community groups are able to come to coalition and push back against some of those bad actors, because a lot of those bad actors, to your point, have been pushing the policies that we've been seeing for far too long. And to your point on C4 funding, you know, there's Boulder Advocacy is an organization I can think of that has really good guidelines on how all funders can give towards C4 activism or to C3s that are operating in that space. So thank you for bringing that up. And Kara, I'd like to turn to you now and think about it, to continue to dig into these issues. On our call actually last week, you know, you reminded me of California's position in the national landscape. I sometimes forget, you know, how large California is, how populous the state is, and how our influence on local, regional, and statewide efforts can, you know, what influence we can have on a national scale. So not only the new administration on the federal side, but California has set some pretty ambitious goals just transition, phasing out new fracking permits by 2024, introducing zero emission vehicles, among a handful of others. So how do you believe, or how do you think that a more amenable federal administration will help California achieve some of these goals, and what will it mean for the rest of the country?
Thanks, Roger. And thanks, Sam, and thanks, Katie. I think I'm going to be somewhat boring in that I'm going to agree with a lot of what Sam and Katie said, and hopefully build on their remarks a bit. I'm really happy to hear Sam's perspective that from DC and from the Biden administration, there's a recognition of the continuing importance of work in California on climate. And I absolutely agree with Katie that the lessons that California has to give to both DC and to other jurisdictions who are now pushing forward on climate maybe more aggressively than they used to, the lessons fall on both sides of the ledger. There are, lessons about what California has done right, and there are lessons about what California has done wrong. But California, as Katie said, has been working at this now for, depending on when you start counting, 14 years since AB 32. Certainly we're 10 years ahead on the climate policy curve of most other jurisdictions. And for that reason, I consider it a real privilege for me, and really for, I think, probably all the people on this call, to be able to influence what happens in California climate policy, at least to some degree, because what happens here really does resonate throughout the rest of the country and throughout the rest of the world. I will never forget traveling to one of the UN climate conferences years ago with a group of students from UCLA and walking through the halls of a conference center in South Africa and being with delegates from all around the world, and many of them spoke languages that we didn't understand. But one phrase that I kept hearing over and over, even from groups that were not speaking English, was AB 32. Which is, of course, California's, landmark, now 14-year-old climate policy passed by Senator Fran Pavley and others. And it set us on a path to meet what was then a really ambitious climate emission reduction goal by 2020. And as the chart that Katie started off with showed you, California has made progress, in fact, has met that goal, but in ways that are vastly imperfect, but tremendously influential. And so I agree completely that the work that we have done in California over the last 15 years, and more importantly, the work that I think we have in front of us over the next 2, 3, 5, certainly 10 years, really has the potential to influence the national dialogue along and beyond in climate policy in ways that are important. So I'll give you some examples. You saw, again, from some of Katie's charts that California has made pretty good progress transforming its electricity sector. It's not alone in this, right? The electricity sector has lots of the low-hanging fruit on climate policy. We've done this through standards, importantly. I think I see Katie nodding. It in part illustrates the importance of standards. We've done it through the Renewable Portfolio Standard. We've done it through energy efficiency standards, right? We've also really pushed in innovative ways transportation emission standards. We've been less effective so far in moving the needle in overall transportation emissions, but we've done really good policy work, modeled policy development work that has actually been adopted in other jurisdictions and hopefully will be adopted again under a Biden administration nationally on how to reduce emissions from cars. Those are some sort of success stories and places where I think California can talk about lessons it's learned that are on the positive side of the ledger. But there's still tremendous amount to be done. As Katie said, on industrial sector emissions, there's still a tremendous amount to be done on transportation emissions. And most importantly, there's a tremendous amount to be done to figure out how to advance climate policy in a way that serves our racial equity goals, in a way that develops jobs, in a way that leads to the kind of just transition that we now very broadly and thankfully recognize is necessary, but quite frankly, we don't actually know how to do yet. And because California is sort of ahead of the rest of the country on the climate policy curve, we have an opportunity to get out in front on these issues. So to me, if I'm thinking about strategic places to spend time and effort in California, especially over the next couple of years on the environment, I'm thinking about ways to help California push its climate policy and local governments in California to push their climate policy in a way that is consonant with job creation goals and racial equity goals. Those are just critical questions for me. And then once we figure out, or if we figure out how to do that here, there's just tremendous upside for exporting these lessons to the rest of the country. That's what I find most exciting about California environmental policy at the moment. And I'll stop there. We can keep talking and questions.
I really appreciate it. It gets me excited, thinking about the potential, thinking about the next stage that we have, and to your all's point, from 2021 and beyond. So, fingers crossed. There's a lot that's going to be happening. Before I ask this next question, I want to encourage y'all to just begin, entering your questions in the chat there, and also open it up to the three of you. If you have anything that piqued your interest or anything that you want to expand upon of your own comments or others that you just want to bring up.
I will
Right.
say from one
Oh,
perspective, I'll just like chime in here. Something that I'm really hopeful for with the federal administration when it comes to revenue. Part of the problem in California is we've constructed these market mechanisms to generate revenue, and they don't always. We saw this last year. A very unknown thing happened where California climate investments just didn't get spent last year. We just didn't spend any money there because the auction had bottomed out, and we were worried that future auctions would. So there's no money going into climate investments this year except for the 4 continuously appropriated projects. So something that we've been pushing for in California around wealth tax and capital gains taxes, and really closing corporate tax loopholes, really does need to be done at a federal level, and would be great to be done at a federal level. So folks aren't just moving their wealth out of California, and we are trying to capture that and distribute that back out to communities for investments in things like just transitions and pension guarantees, and the sort of work that we need to do if we're really going to start moving the needle, especially on fossil fuels. So I do want to chime that in as well, since Sam's on the call, to put a pin in the folks' ear that we really need that. And in California, we're really struggling with that because we know we need we know what we need to do at the local level to transition, but like it's going to take money. Any of it's going to take money. And there's simply no mechanism in play right now that doesn't perpetuate inequity that can generate that kind of revenue except for those policies.
And I was just going to chime in on this as well, particularly the part that Kara raised around standards and how, and I just dropped in the chat how they are better than pricing. We constructed the Inslee climate agenda for the campaign, and since then the Evergreen Action Plan on this basis of standards, investment, and justice, and actually a little known fourth principle around ending fossil fuel giveaways and subsidies and corporate giveaways, sort of the less spoken of fourth child in that family. But standards really, California's experience bears it out, as do other states, and local progress have been the tool that have really driven emissions reductions and economic changes. And you need those standards to drive forward change. And unfortunately, the way Congress is constructed, that's going to prevent some standards from being passed at the federal level, like a clean electricity standard. But fortunately, there is existing authorities on the books to transform vehicle fleets, to transform buildings and appliance standards that the Biden-Harris administration will have on day one that they can really use to drive forward that. But that's not also, you need all these legs of the stool. And Katie, to your point, this is an agenda for reinvestments, and the federal government is unencumbered like states are with balanced budget requirements. We're going to need states with fiscal relief and better financial news sooner than later so that they can continue to invest. But the federal government's got to be investing in a better economic recovery and a sustainable, clean energy driven economic recovery. And then throughout standards investment, we need a central commitment to justice and protecting those communities that have long borne the brunt of environmental racism, not to mention the accelerating impacts of climate change.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's I'm glad that you all brought it up, and there's a question here that kind of speaks to that, thinking about policies, thinking about different environmental actions, and while they may seem good in theory and practice, and it's all good from I believe from a process and how the mechanics work, but how do you communicate that to the general public? There's a question here that says, can you touch on the outreach approaches that you've seen that have succeeded or that have worked along with policies or different mechanisms for environmental progress?
Yeah, we something that was lesser known in the last scoping plan update because ARB has, coincidentally, it's not available on their website anywhere, but we have it if anybody needs it. When the EJ Advisory Committee was convened in 2015, we decided that we wouldn't provide recommendations to ARB unless they worked with the Air Resources Board, unless they let us do workshops in the communities. And it took a lot of pushing. They wanted us to get it done, give us the recos in the next 3 months. And we kept saying, nope, we're not going to do it until you let us go out and talk to folks. So we organized workshops. We ended up doing 19 workshops from the border with in Karuk, Yurok territory, all the way down to the other border with Mexico and Calexico and cities down there, and modeled it. We created the curriculum, and what we were doing was partnering with groups on the ground to help us do outreach and organize logistics. And so each of the EJ members that was in that area helped organize and message out what this meant. And we know how to do this. We know how to talk to people about what's going on from a health perspective, what this means for communities and change and jobs and investments. And so it doesn't require, it really means leaning on those local voices that are present, especially in Southern California, but all over the state and country who know how to do that work and giving us space to do that work. ARB found a great way to essentially pay for us because they couldn't pay for childcare and food. And so what they did is they essentially contracted with us to organize the meetings, and they gave us each a couple $100, and then we used that money to pay for childcare and food in each location and interpretation when it was needed. And it worked really, really well. Air Resources Board didn't accept any of our recommendations after that process, but it created this 40-page document that really outlined what we thought needed to be done to start moving the needle on environmental justice. And so there are great models out there. And I think what we're seeing now through like the geologic energy, the management division, CalGEM, the workshops they're doing on the public health and safety rulemaking, very informed by communities, same way they went out, how do we do this? We worked with them on those workshops. The frontline groups took lead, and we saw, I think 40,000 comments ended up getting submitted for that draft rule. And that was at the beginning of the pandemic. People were still actively engaged because they went through the organizers. So I think there's a model here that can be built upon that's shown great success in this area in helping with that very issue.
I guess from an education and somewhat academic perspective, I can add to that a bit and talk about efforts that I've seen work to educate the next generation of environmental leaders. I know from talking with my students every day that they're already, much more engaged in these issues and so much more passionate about the stakes and understanding of the stakes at issue in the climate policy world than, certainly my cohort was when we were coming up. And I've seen really tremendously effective local climate education efforts spring up from grassroots organizations that have the mission of just connecting climate change to, not, global effects or what's going to happen at the poles or with polar bears, but actually what's going to happen to people in their neighborhoods, to the communities that they care about, what it's going to mean to them personally. And when you start heading into neighborhoods and using, exactly as Katie said, trusted messengers to begin to talk about climate change impacts at the local level, what this will mean for your family, what this will mean for your community, it really can make a difference in building the kind of political power that Katie was talking about building before. And I've seen that happen. It's most effective, in my view, when, again, it's arising from not necessarily national environmental groups, as much as I love them. I came out of the NRDC world myself, right? The big green enviros, but actually this kind of education is most impactful when it's sort of more bottom up and comes from local organizations and local messengers who can really ground the message in what they're seeing in their communities and what the impacts will be in their communities in 5, 10, and 15 years.
Yeah, and just to go back on what Cara was saying, it's Kara, sorry. It was, like they know what's going on. Frontline communities observe, like when they started putting oil wells outside of schools and Shafter, like those mothers didn't know what toxic chemicals were. They didn't know about like the diesel emissions from the nearby motors, but they knew that kids at the school started getting sick, and they knew that it was like tied to when that came, this started happening. And so a lot of it's just giving people the tools to articulate like what they're already seeing and helping them see the policy pathway that we're talking about in climate policy. There's a lot of expertise in the communities, and we didn't even know that fracking discharge water was being used to irrigate ag fields in the valley. I mean, we didn't know a lot of these things, but the communities knew. They just didn't know what it was called. So I think tapping into that resource, like Cara was saying, it's the expertise is there, the interest is there. It's just how do we provide the meaningful pathway?
So this next question is kind of a combo of a couple of them here, and it's talking about how in a general sense how to advance investments in the environmental sector. So California's advanced clean truck rule will increase a zero emissions vehicle sales requirement, and it's critical to reducing transportation, air, and climate pollution. Several states in the United States are looking to adopting, but do you see that there are going to be any kind of federal actions on this specific policy, or within policies, and Katie, to your point, with homegrown issues such as oil drilling or such as setbacks? How and is that possible to advance on a national scale? And sorry for the jumbled question there. Kind of combined two.
I just want to say that I think this is one area that we really need the federal government to take more directive action. California, unfortunately, when we passed our gas tax increase, SB1, several years ago, there was what we called a poison pill amendment in that language that really tied California's hands on how quickly we could direct heavy duty trucks to change equipment and to adopt cleaner equipment standards. I think the general rule was like, once you do something, we can't ask you to do anything else for 10 more years. And so I think in a way, the federal government acting on this and pushing down from that level would be more helpful in expediting that, because it's another area where the technology is there and it's becoming more cost effective, but California unfortunately is limited in our ability to direct people to do this. And unfortunately, with the passage of things like Prop 22 in California, when it comes to independent contractors, one of the other big gaping loopholes and why environmental justice groups were so interested in this, in addition for just the economic justice, is because a lot of truck drivers are classified as independent, even though they're not. And so how do you enforce this when it's a sole proprietor, in theory, who owns their own truck and isn't getting the resources from their trucking company to change out their vehicle or to purchase something new? We've created sort of a weird matrix that is going to be hard for us to advance that more quickly, and we need to. So it's something I know I would love to see the federal government take more action on.
Yeah, just to add to that, I agree that the federal government's authorities over transportation technology using the Clean Air Act are probably stronger than power or buildings or really much else. I mean, there's ready-made authorities in the Clean Air Act and EPA, but even and it's to go after all manner of vehicle emissions. And I think there's probably a debate to be had about how they're going to go about doing that vis-a-vis state-based efforts as well. Some of it may be relying upon California's leadership, like on light-duty vehicles, and letting states follow them as the bad cop, while the federal government sets another standard. What we have pressed for, what we've argued for, is, Katie, not unlike what you were talking about, which is really utilizing that full suite of federal authorities to drive at clean cars, clean trucks, clean medium duty vehicles throughout those federal authorities, because they are strong and they're going to be needed, and not to mention they're going to be needed across state lines that many of them are not going to follow California's lead. I also love just to respond very briefly to the other question around investments and around how can the Biden administration get investments out, and how can grantees effectively work with state and local partners. I think this is actually a really, really critical question in this moment while we wait for Congress to get something done. I'm not holding out a hope they're going to move quickly or nearly sizably enough, considering the Senate majority that remains in place until and unless something happens in Georgia. But there are existing federal tools, namely federal finance authorities, that do provide dollars that can get into the community. And I think the biggest gap that we have in getting those dollars into the community oftentimes is not the federal programs themselves. Yes, they'll be bureaucratic heavy. Yes, they require paperwork, but it's actually capacity within communities to apply for and to receive those dollars. I mean, everything from community groups to even your rural electric co-ops. There is dollars at RUS, there's dollars at DOE, there are dollars throughout the federal administration that are ready to be deployed And if God willing, the Biden and Harris administration staffs those programs with creative and ambitious people, we can, tee up the federal government to be ready to push those dollars out. I think a huge place where states need help. I can speak on this from personal experience, having worked in state government, trying to get rural co-ops to apply to RUS dollars, for example, and certainly with local communities. How can grantees support capacity building so that they're ready to receive, they're ready to go get and to receive federal dollars? It's a gap, it's a lack. I think it's something that we're all going to need to be attentive to and think even more creatively about, given that federal dollars could be hard to come by at the scale we're going to need them to come by, considering how Congress is situated.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and kind of leads me to my next question, and thinking about that on a broad sense of, bolstering the capacity of our grantees and thinking about our partners in the field. And for all of you, there's a handful of people on the call today represent local, state, national actors, and looking to support environmental efforts here in Southern California that span everything from energy to EJ to policy advocacy. So what advice, building on that capacity building and building on that, supporting some of those frontline organizations, do you have for those that are thinking about these funding strategies? What advice would you give them for collaboration or setting some of those priorities?
I think I keep talking first, but I'll just keep doing that. I was going to wait. I think the most effective partnerships we've had with funders are the ones who really just want to sit down and learn about the work. The ones who really want to think about what's going on, where is there growth, where are you struggling with, and really figure out how to invest in those strategic opportunities. And not so much super hands-on, nobody wants a funder to come into all of your meetings and be like, no, do it this way, but like to really listen and build and help them build. Like one area, the reason I mentioned something like C4 funding is like there are C4s in existence in the Central Valley, in oil country, in LA that don't have any resources. And I think if you really open the door to a conversation with those organizations, they would tell you that this is something we know we need to get ahead of, because we know this is a problem at the local and state level with elected officials. So I think those sort of listening relationships, and there's some funders on this call who do that quite well. I'll just do a little shout out to Angie from Libra Foundation. When I was at SEHA, that was like the first thing she did. I just want to learn about what's going on. What are you seeing? What's happening? How's it going? And that's so helpful to build a trusting relationship and to ensure that the money is really meeting the need as much as it can.
I can jump in and just add a few things to amplify those points. I think returning to my overarching message and priority, which was about helping or doing all we can at the local level to help California reach its climate goals. My sense is that to the extent that funding local efforts and local communities can be done in a way that also supports California's efforts to reach its, frankly, really ambitious climate goals it has set for itself over the next, 10 and 15 years. That's a win-win. And I'll give you some examples. So California has set a goal that it will end the sale of fossil fuel cars in California by 2035. I would say that before we knew the results of the presidential election, that goal was quite aspirational. Now that we know that there will be a Biden-Harris administration, that goal is within sight. Like, we think we're going to get that Clean Air Act waiver. We're going to use our California authorities. And I think we're going to, figure out a way to get that done. But what that means at the local level still remains to be seen. And whether we can achieve that goal in a way that reduces inequities remains to be seen, right, among communities. Are we just going to wind up with a bunch of relatively well-off Californians driving around EVs, right, while disadvantaged communities remain kind of left out of the party, I think is an important question. And so when funders are thinking about funding local efforts, if they can keep in mind these overarching California goals and also the goal to figure out how to reach these statewide goals in a way that doesn't increase inequities and ideally actually decreases inequities, that's my sweet spot, right?
And I'm just gonna add, building on these very good comments, and this is slightly more global from my perspective, but relates obviously to California. Is the burgeoning, I don't want to say alliance, but the burgeoning coalescing around sort of a standards investment and justice vision, or a climate good jobs and justice vision, where you do have an opportunity for these differential but related crises around the economy, around racial injustice, around climate, being brought together in a coherent agenda that can lift boats from across the movement, from across a diverse movement here that has really been congealing around traditional environmental advocates, environmental justice advocates, labor unions and related organizations, frontline communities. And this is these coalitions aren't in lockstep. But they are, I think, growing ever. We are finding more and more opportunities to be rowing together in a direction, and finding ways of continuing to build upon that alliance, or that burgeoning alliance, that burgeoning opportunity for alliance, is really, really key. And I think is driving us towards more progressive and just policy outcomes versus where we lived a decade or 15 or 20 years ago, when it was a different set of partners, largely focused on the business community, sort of driving at pricing first, macroeconomic signals to achieve our environmental goals.
Alrighty, I wanted to thank the three of you. I believe we may be at time right now, but I think we're going to be entering into our networking portion. We're going to break out into small groups and be able to continue this conversation, because I think that this is just really the tip of the iceberg. Being able to jump into, and there's still a lot of questions, talking about EJ, talking about economy, talking about how, Katie, to your point, what that Venn diagram looks like, and where each one of our foundations, our interests lie. So I think I'm going to pass it to either Katie or Ron, and help along with that kind of separation. But I just really wanted to thank the three of you having the opportunity to save some time for us today and learn a lot about what's up, what's next, and how we can plug in. So thank you.
Excellent. And thank you so much to everybody. Very insightful conversations, and we can continue that in small group conversations. I invite folks who are able to stay on for the small group section. This would be a good time to turn on your camera so we can see if you're interested in continuing the conversation. And if some of you have to drop off from the call right now, that is also totally fine. If we have more than 10 people, we'll split up into two groups. If we have less than 10, we can just stay together as a large group. So folks are finding that camera option. Okay, great. Alex, you are that mysterious user 395. That's what your name says. So great. And I did see in the chat box a question that John put in. I don't know if we fully got to, that I thought was a good question. We've been talking about climate and clean energy. What other opportunities are there for environmental investments in the first 100 days and in the first 2 years, so that the new administration delivers real, visible results for economic and environmental equity? So I think that's a question also worth discussing. It looks like we've got a total of 12. I think we can stay together in one large group, unless go like this. If you want to do two small groups, we can break up into two smaller groups. Okay, then why don't we stay as one large group for this follow-up conversation? And I think we can get to John's questions, but I think why don't we just have the funders on the call just introduce themselves. Maybe I'll call some names. And then if there's anything you want to contribute to the conversation, I will put in the chat box some potential questions as well. But let's just get a sense for who's with us, and I'll just call in folks. So maybe Alex, and then Michelle, and then Jasmine.
Hi, everybody. I am Alex Paxton. I'm a program officer with the Water Foundation. I am based in LA. My project work is focused on LA and Southern California. And I think everything that has been said can also relate to water issues. But I'd love it if other people had thoughts too about bringing water into that conversation. And thanks to the panel. That was an amazing presentation and facilitation.
Thanks, Alex. How about Michelle?
Hi, everyone. Michelle Pritchard. I am Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives at the Liberty Hill Foundation. I'm getting feedback, huh?
Oh, now we can't hear you. So we can manage the feedback. There you go.
Yeah. So thank you to the panelists. Agreed, it was great. I guess I just put a question in the chat, and something I'd like to talk about is whether we are serious about really trying to take action around limiting or ending fossil fuel expansion projects, even while we push forward as fast as we can on conservation and renewables and the like. So.
Great, thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Good to see you. How about Jasmine and then Ruben?
Hi, sorry, Ring Central is a new one for me. My name is Jasmine Guevara. I'm with Cedars-Sinai Health System here in Southern California. So we're very interested in the health nexus, which I don't even know if it's a nexus. It is environmental justice, right? Is health justice, is justice in general. So they are two concepts that are, I'd say, unfortunately, kind of inextricable from each other. So we are very interested in looking at it from that kind of health angle. I'm personally very interested in kind of local level coalition building, and I think we were all kind of waiting out the administration change to see how scalable any interventions that are happening will be. And I'd say I'm very optimistic. This call has made me even more optimistic. So thank you so much to the panelists for that. But I think as a health system, we have more of an impetus to be involved in these conversations. So I'm very grateful that the door has always been open with the Environmental Funders Group.
Great, thanks, Jasmine, and welcome. And I think what we'll do is we can go through the intros, and I think that's good. We can do John's question and Michelle's question, and then we can, so speakers, I'd love to hear if some of you have comments on that. Let's go to Ruben, then John, then Lindsay.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. Great to see familiar faces and not so familiar faces. I work with the Better World Group on behalf of funders working on clean transportation and clean energy and climate policy, primarily in California and many of the other states that follow California's transportation policies. I appreciate the breath of fresh air we can all take looking forward rather than having to fight such attacks on federal and California policies. And I don't think we've yet allowed, or I haven't yet allowed myself to come out of the bunker because it's been such a difficult time. But I appreciate, Michelle, your framing of when do we get serious holistically. And I feel like we've got to bridge the gap between accelerating an equitable demand side for clean energy and clean transportation with getting rid of extraction, which in California has been so hard to get to make possible with, even the LA City Council. So anyway, appreciate being here and appreciate the California leadership. And also in this moment, we can't think federal is going to solve it all. We got to figure out what we can do in state to continue to make a more sustainable world here. Thanks, Ron.
Great, thanks, Ruben. Let's see John, then Lindsay.
Hi, John Christensen. I teach and do research in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA. Most of my work focuses on environmental equity and access. And in this context, I'm also on the board of the Liberty Hill Foundation. And while I totally get and respect Ruben's point and, the conversations that's been had about we can't count on the federal government for everything and need to do things at the state level. I can't help but thinking like, wait a minute, we have a Speaker of the House. We have a Vice President. If our time is not now, is not, this first 100 days and, the first 2 years to really show some, results, that before the midterms, that's where my head is at, that it's wonderful, it's I'm certainly breathing a sigh of relief and, hopefully coming out of our bunkers, but also like, what are the next steps? Because time is short.
Yes, so speakers, that's the first question, but let's go through and finish the introductions. Let's do Lindsay and then Carrie. Okay, Lindsay.
Hi, y'all. I'm Lindsay Thomas, Program Associate at California Endowment. Personally, I'm on a kind of a learning journey as PCE moves into ICD and just the complexities of how ICD spans several systems. So I just kind of want to get just a better idea. So thank you for the session. Thank you, Kim.
Great. And when you say ICD, that's inclusive community development? Okay, just all right. Let's see, Carrie, welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much. And sorry to be such a mysterious participant here. I am a consultant working with the Broad Foundation, which has been doing a strategic assessment. I know many of you have been consulted on that. So, and Sue Chi, who's their program director, had to drop off, so she asked me to join in. So I've been slow on getting up to speed on the tech. I'm really interested to join this conversation.
Great, welcome, happy to have you. And I know on the phone we have Jacqueline with Southern California Grantmakers and Malavika with Environmental Grantmakers Association. So why don't we start with hearing speakers like, this is this moment, the first 100 days, the first 2 years. Now, like, what are and so love to hear from each of you, your kind of 2 big takeaways.
This sounds like a question Sam should start with to me.
I'm happy to. I mean, got a lot of good questions being raised across the board. And I want to come back. I want to come back to things like water and things like direct fossil fuel extraction. I mean, I think, and the things like the federal versus state leadership. And believe me, I spent a bunch of time at the state level trying to move the ball forward. And people are saying, oh, you're doing that so we can have a template for federal action. Like, no, I'm doing it because meaningful state policy is an end in itself, not a means to an end somewhere else. But in reality, it is also both. So how do you use it for both? Look, I think this is still a moment when we've just won the presidency for the United States of America. And there's an opportunity to use that power, both with Congress and without it. And I think right off the bat, the ball needs to continue to be, the pressure needs to continuously be exerted upon them. I talked about how the Biden-Harris administration or campaign ran on climate. They did, how they're building a transition around it. They're focused on it. Does that mean any of us can let up with our haranguing them about the need to go as fast as possible? No. And so that means, what are the day one actions that set the ball moving forward so they've got truly a whole of government agenda? There's a number of things. I mean, obviously, rejoining Paris is like the minimum ante. But then what are the things you're tasking every agency to come back with? What are the precise mechanisms you're using to build upon environmental justice policy throughout the government? I think there's been a lot of discussion about basically reopening the 93 Clinton Environmental Justice Executive Order and building new systems and processes that flow from that, using existing authorities to do things like track and identify disadvantaged communities, to set in place policies within places like NEPA and Clean Air Act that actually account for meaningful policy change that affects and will support or avoid adverse impact in marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And I think there's a bunch more to be doing around investment right off the bat, right? Federal procurement, finance authorities, things you can do, not to mention the negotiation you've got to have with Congress. I think, in all of this, and I think there was a question in here too about, hey, how do we get people to focus when there are so many things to focus on? And I think is what I think of our community. I think we're all part of a broader community. You're fighting for a similar agenda. I think our categorization and focus is among our most difficult challenges, because the task is so big. You've got to find things and exert your authority under. And when it comes to that, I think about some discrete items to really get after. You think about them in terms of sectors, and you think about them in terms of themes and dynamics. Sectors, meaning your big, what are you going to do with existing authorities vis-a-vis the power sector? What are you going to do with existing authorities vis-a-vis the transportation sector, buildings, et cetera? And then what are you going to do with existing authorities for the creation of good union jobs in this space, for achieving greater environmental justice, for an innovation agenda? And then overlay on top of that, what are your things you're taking to Congress to try and get done? And I think the pressure needs to be continuously brought to bear against congressional Democrats, some of whom I think have been learning the wrong lessons from what just transpired in this election, that somehow the Green New Deal or climate action was not good for them, when all the actual data is bearing out as actually it was. If you look at it, Biden increased upon the Clinton margin in 8 out of 10 fracking counties in Pennsylvania, right? Donald Trump thought he was playing a trump card. Sorry for the terrible pun. Playing a trump card by leaning into oil and gas at the end of the election. He wasn't. I mean, but for maybe a couple of districts in Texas and southern New Mexico, which is not the base of where the Democratic Party won this election, he was not. It was not the winner he thought it was. So really exerting the fact that, hey, you ran on this, it's time to go implement it. This is a day one agenda thing is where attention is. I hope those thoughts were helpful.
So I can jump in. Thanks, Sam. I don't have that much more to add. I will say I'm totally with you, John. Like, this is an exciting big moment, and we need to make sure we don't lose it and we take advantage of it. And although we do have the presidency and we do have the Speaker of the House, it's a big deal that we don't have the Senate. And so a lot of the biggest, splashiest, quickest things that one might imagine doing if we had taken the Senate too are actually harder and slower to do without the Senate. So it's this, political division or divided government is in tension with the idea of seizing early wins to some degree. So then the question is, as Sam said, like, well, where can we still get the early splashy wins that help to show how important it is to, keep this progress going? And, reasserting international leadership is obviously something that's well within Biden's control. I think there's, procurement policies, which Sam talked about. I think there are areas of tax credits that, we could make progress on in this political environment. I think the two most potentially helpful areas are, one, on extractive policies. So this relates to Michelle's question too, which I think that we want to turn to next. I find it really interesting. I actually meant to bring this up when I talked about lessons from California. California this is an example of a lesson from California of like places we haven't made enough progress, and places, where California might teach a lesson on the difficulty of really digging deep on climate policy when it comes to supply side questions. So it's clear California hasn't figured out yet how to find the political will to tamp down on extraction in a meaningful way. Hopefully, I think California is further along that path, though, again, going back to my theme, than other places. So if we can push that in California, maybe that will resonate in the national level. And I actually think the Biden administration could do something big and splashy on extractive policies on federal land in the first 100 days, and that would be really helpful. Because this seems like the moment, the next 100 days, year, 2 years seems like the moment to really push that conversation on extractive policies in an interesting direction. And then the economic relief package that is sure to happen in some form or another in the first, hopefully 100 days, could include interesting elements that relate to these equity and just transition questions. And so my wish list would include all kinds of, infrastructure and just transition aspects of that economic relief package. Katie, you probably have things to add.
Yeah, and I hope So I'm going to broach something here that may make a few people bristle, and I'm okay with that, and I hope you are too. There's this document called Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, and basically how white supremacy shows up in the work. And one of the key characteristics of white supremacy culture is urgency. And that's hard to marry with climate policy because we recognize that we need to move quickly, but how we move is just as important as what we achieve. And something that I think would make me incredibly sad would be if we started rolling out policies and solutions for communities without giving communities an opportunity to bubble up what those ideas could look like in their states and communities. That's there. It's already there. It'll be more innovative. It'll land on the ground much better because communities will be invested in it. And I think that will be frustrating for folks. I'm having that fight even locally in Sacramento with leaf blowers and stuff. They're like, just do it now. And I'm like, well, the operators are going to get hit with fines if we don't take the time to actually educate folks on how to do this. And doing it better is, this is the ultimate lesson from California is like, oh, we'll do it and we'll figure it out later. And then we end up with the low carbon fuel standard that actually incentivizes natural gas more than it does electric vehicles, which how does that make sense in the big scheme of things, So I know it's tempting to move forward quickly, but I really hope that this administration just takes a minute. It's not going to take long. We're pretty organized in the EJ space across the country. There's a few people you can call, and we'll all get on a call very readily with the president-elect and vice president-elect to say, this is what we need from you if we're really going to make this work. So that's my big picture thing. But when it comes to fossil fuel, we're actually not that far advanced. We're actually one of the few states that doesn't have setbacks in law for all oil operations. And, in California, what we're seeing right now is we are not only this unholy alliance between building trades and oil, which is something we could probably have a whole nother call about, but local jurisdictions are stepping up and saying, okay, we're going to adopt setbacks. So you're seeing this being considered in LA, city and county, Ventura, all these cities are stepping up, Culver City, and saying, we're going to do it. And they're getting hit. And they're getting hit hard and they're getting hit fast. I think there's at least a dozen lawsuits in the works in Ventura County alone right now. And we've got advocates on the ground who are like, we don't have the resources to fight this. And if we lose those fights, we know what that means. And so how can we kind of buffer around what's happening in specifically Southern California communities that are trying to step up and do this so that we can set a legal precedent for why this needs to continue. Because the Newsom administration is happy to step back and let the locals fight over takings. They're happy to step back and let them argue over whether or not we took something from them with their mineral rights or whatever. And we need to be really strategic and tuned into the communities to know that's happening. And I was just on a call yesterday where Sierra Club was saying, look, we're going to try what we can, but we don't have the resources. And if anybody has legal resources, let us know. And that comes back to just the capacity question and your question, Alex, about water, because there was a while there where we didn't do Setbacks Coalition calls because all of our frontline organizers were out in U-Haul trucks with, cases of Arrowhead water or whatever they could get their hands on at the start of the pandemic, trying to get water out to folks whose deliveries have been interrupted or stopped when the pandemic set in. So it is very much the same audience. And I think it really keeps coming back to internal capacity. They don't have the staffing to really focus on water the way they want to, and I know they want to. A lot of these groups know, and the intersections are so obvious and they're dealing with it every day, but nobody's fighting that fight. We knew when the budget was going through with California and our first round of federal relief that we needed utility shutoffs, we needed water shutoff money, we needed debt payment assistance. We knew what we needed to do, but we didn't have the push available to really get that through. So those are my first quick thoughts, but I'm sure there's more to be said.
Great, thank you, Katie. And I'm curious if others, Kara or Sam, have other thoughts to Michelle's question around extraction, stopping, what does it take to stop the subsidies, et cetera.
Yeah, look, I think there's a clear and present suite of federal authorities that can be used, and indeed, there's already been a commitment from the Biden campaign to use them. Against new leasing on federal lands, that's a start, and offshore waters, that's a start, right? There was obviously plenty of discussion during the campaign around fracking. I think it all revolved around ban or no ban. I think that in reality, there's a even with the commitment or lack thereof, certain commitment from Biden administration, I think that any sort of ban was going to require congressional action, and that was going to be impossible, even if Democrats did control both chambers, and they won't. But the reality is the authorities you've got in the federal government can make such extraction very difficult. I think the places where you're going to run into greater challenge is in confronting existing leases that you've got, even on federal lands, certainly in the private sector space, and in trying to pursue things like setbacks. I think you can probably be very restrictive with existing authorities, and I would start there. I think more power needs to be built within communities and then within the halls of Congress to get at the true sort of turning off the tap agenda we're going to need to stay under 1.5C. So, and to Katie's point, that's got to begin in states, and that's got to begin in states that fancy themselves climate leaders.
Yeah, and when it comes to federal action, though, I mean, 40% of the crude extracted from the Amazon forest is coming to California refineries, and like we can't do anything about it. And like I'm starting work with Amazon Watch right now because we're trying to figure out, okay, is there a partnership with frontline groups and refinery communities to try to regulate refineries, and maybe by tamping that down, we can stop the inflow, which will hopefully slow the extraction. But it's all this sort of weird backdoorsy acrobatic approaches we're trying to get at an issue that needs to be regulated nationally, because we can't get through some of these trade issues. You know, we can't get to some of these import-export issues. And in California, our oil and gas administrator firmly believes that if we decrease production in California, it's just going to increase production elsewhere. And there is no data we can show him that will prove him otherwise. And that's going to take, whether it's a policy direction, whether it's an executive order, something from the feds that says this is the path that we're going on to get him to even engage with us on reducing production in California. And so, yeah, there's a lot the feds can do on like land they control, obviously, but like there's this whole other question on like what is that future path and how do we get there, that we can't even answer because it's too easy for them to pawn it off on the feds or to pawn it off on something else. And we need that direction. My heart broke when Biden and Kamala said that they weren't going to support fracking bans. I was just like, oh, well, how are we going to get anywhere if we can't get around fracking? Like we can all get there, right? It's such a small percentage. Like, let's start there. But, you know, we need to be ambitious and we need that vision to come from the top if we're going to be able to push, because the organizing is there. It's just, we don't have the support and the vision, unfortunately. And that's what really needs to, if we're going to force people to the table, that's what's the signal that we could get.
Great, thank you. I'm realizing we only have a few more minutes, so is there somebody who wants to share something that hasn't been said or a question to raise that hasn't yet been raised? We have a few more minutes. Looks like Michelle maybe is unmuted. No, okay.
And Carrie put a question about the ZEV rule in the chat.
And I know Kara already spoke to this a little bit, but I mean, Katie, on the, restricting demand and restricting imports, restricting production in California and restricting imports, and, and then I'd love just to hear this group's thoughts on the ZEV rulemaking that California is embarking on, and kind of how that's showing up in your priorities and, the opportunities and kind of thoughts on how to engage on that, effectively.
I mean, I will start just by saying I put this in the same camp as like building decarbonization, where we all know that's where we need to go, but how we get there is really, really important. You can't own a ZEV in California unless you have a parking spot, either in a garage or a driveway, because you can't charge it unless you have a parking spot, either in a garage or a driveway. And that means everybody, like there's wealthy homeowners in Sacramento who don't have driveways that are trying to install charging stations like on their street in the little, strip of public thing, and they're being told no. And so there's these huge questions that need to be addressed from an access perspective if we're going to do that well. And I mean, you still have communities that need panel upgrades in their homes. I mean, you have people who have these really expensive infrastructure improvements that need to happen for them to be able to handle this increase in electricity use that we haven't addressed. So how we get there, I'm glad that we set a target because it forces us to answer these questions. But, there's a real problem here when it comes to like where the pun intended, rubber meets the road, when it comes to like, how is this going to work? What does this mean for the mom and pop gas stations? Like, this is a real site in the community that could be used for EV charging, that could become hubs for making that demand, but they have franchise agreements that are precluding them from offering other fueling at their sites because Chevron and Exxon say, nope, it's either our stuff alone or you can't do it. And so like, there's all these weird policy barriers that exist for us to really have that conversation. And so I'd love to see this similarly, right? Like, bring the communities in, let's work on a roadmap. Like, let's figure out what are the steps we think we need to take to really get there and start ticking away at those policy obstacles and funding obstacles so we can make it work for everybody.
And I agree with Katie's point that there's going to need to be a suite of things, infrastructure investments, chief among them, and to make sure this works. I also just do want to say, I think there's very little that is as important as a thing like a ZEV mandate. I mean, we wrote one into the Inslee plan, and it's with an even more aggressive time frame, which admittedly would be challenging. There's going to be massive investment that's going to be needed in manufacturing capacity around this, not to mention the materials that go into them, that are all going to be challenges. This is a scale of industrial transformation that's ultimately going to be necessary, and it needs to happen as soon as possible. I mean, the reality is 2035 for all ZEVs for light duty vehicles, and you're turning over vehicle fleets now in about 15 years on average. That puts you right up against the window of 2050 for the nationwide decarbonization. We've got to move faster. You look at what the United States did during World War II. It had much faster industrial transformations than that even. But I will just say, critically important to have a ZEV mandate and want to see it. I think there's a number of ways to go about doing that nationwide. I think there's a kind of a strategic question here about whether you let states follow California's lead with a waiver that's reinstated, or you actively pursue a federal standard to match it. I prefer the latter. There may be a strategic call that's to be made of where you start with an interim target or what have you. I think there are clear existing authorities, namely under the Federal Clean Air Act, to be used in pursuing them. But again, there's nothing more important. Light duty vehicles making up 60% of transportation emissions nationwide, which make it the bulk of the bulk sector, right? The largest part of the largest sector. We've got to do ZEVs. I agree totally with Katie. We've got to make them more accessible. We've got to allow people to. We got to make sure that we can build them here in the U.S. too. That's going to be a key part politically as well as substantively and economically. But we are going to need the policy, and as many places as possible. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, great.
And I
would just add.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, and I hear, Sam's urgency and need for speed, and Katie's discussion of the need for panel upgrades and, infrastructure changes in neighborhoods. And I think jobs, right? This is one of those areas where I feel like we could get multiple benefits, and we could do it pretty quickly if we do it right, which I find inspiring, but also a little daunting.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, with the electrification of transportation, we also need to keep in mind land use and kind of how we build, where we build, and how do we build compact, dense, sustainable, walkable, bikeable communities. So we don't need to drive everywhere in the United States of America. So I think, marrying electrification and land use and active mobility. Hey, that was the facilitator's last word right there. We're just about wrapped up. I really want to thank all of you for staying on a little longer. It's good to just see, again, familiar faces and some new faces to just chat and be in dialogue. Thank you so much. Thanks again to our speakers and presenters. Deeply appreciative for all the work you're doing at various levels on various interconnected issues. I'm walking away from this more hopeful, although also mindful of how big, how much labor and work is going to actually be involved with doing this, and that we all need to stay, vigilant in all levels. So thanks. Mark your calendars for February 19th will be the next one of these quarterly sessions. If there's any other resources, feel free to put them in the chat box. All the speakers will get, everybody attending will get the resources and follow up. And then lastly, we do have an informal steering committee. Several funders are on this call, several Southern California grant makers, Alex Paxton from the Water Foundation, Michelle Pritchard from Liberty Hill, Roger, our fearless moderator today. Thanks again for moderating and setting the stage. and John Christensen from Liberty Hill Donor Advice Fund and UCLA Institute for the Environment, and we have some others. What we typically do in 1 minute, starting in 1 minute, is just take some time to debrief the session, brainstorm ideas for new sessions, and just kind of connect with each other. So it's an open invitation. As long as you're a member of Southern California Grantmakers, you're welcome to stay on and listen in to see if it's a group you want to be a part of, because we're always looking for new folks. But if you need to go on to the next thing, we totally understand, and just want to say thanks again for coming.
Thank you all so much,
Thank
especially
you,
to our speakers.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, they were great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.